Welcome in, everyone. It is a Wednesday. So, you are here for child labor trafficking and intersections with CSE. Now, this is going to be presented by Kelly Amond, and I hope I said your last name right, and Solomon from PACT. And so, I hope you know we had a training a couple of weeks ago. I say now a couple weeks, it was probably about a month ago. That was Child Labor Trafficking 101. And so, if for some reason you missed that training, don't worry. We will have it available for you on our website. You can go back after today's training and take a look at that if you want some more information, or maybe you'd like to share that information or watch that training with coworkers after watching today's training. And so, they're here to dive a little bit deeper and give us some wonderful information. So, on the next slide, I am going to introduce our wonderful speakers today. So I will go ahead and hand it over to Kelly, who is the PACT Regional Coordinator. And then we have Solomon also, who's the PACT Lived Expert Consultant. So go ahead and take it away, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Casey. You were so close. My last name's Amend. Welcome, everybody. I'm glad that you're here. We are so excited to share our training with you today. And as we get started, we want to acknowledge that your presence today reflects your commitment to learning, collaboration, and impact for a future where all youth are free to thrive, free of exploitation and trafficking. If you could go to the next slide, please, I'm going to share a little bit more about myself and our agency. Today's session is presented by PAC consultant, national expert, and attorney Solomon Masood, along with myself. My name's Kelly Amend. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a regional coordinator with the Preventing and Addressing Child Trafficking program, a program of the Child and Family Policy Institute of California, or CFPIC, as you can see our acronyms on our logos here on the slide. We are a California nonprofit serving all 58 counties with a vision to build capacity and lead change across human service agencies. I will also be facilitating today alongside our PACT statewide director, Dr. Denisha Carley, who will be supporting us in the chat with resources and links and Q&A, as well as my colleague Josie Feemster. We're so excited that you're here and invite you to say hello in the chat and introduce yourself. And please let us know where you're joining from. We do have a few housekeeping agreements that we'd like to center with and kindly ask that you be present for the next hour and a half. If you could kindly remove distractions. I really appreciate what Jess shared from CalTrin. The only payment we ask is that you pay attention. We also kindly ask that you engage respectfully, even if you disagree with what myself and my co-presenter are training on or talking about, and that you participate in the chats and the polls that we will have throughout our time together. And we also encourage you to practice self-care. We know that this is an emotional topic and a heavy topic, and we ask that you take care of your needs as you find necessary during our time together. So before we begin, on the next slide, please, a brief word about preventing and addressing child trafficking. So we were founded in 2014. PACT is a collaborative network of child welfare agencies across California working together to ensure youth at risk of or experiencing sex and labor trafficking receive consistent, trauma-informed, and responsive care, no matter where they are geographically in the state. Today, our network includes 49 child welfare agencies statewide, guided by lived expertise and survivor leadership, including a team of consultants, which I'll introduce in a moment. PACT promotes a multidisciplinary, youth-centered approach through training, capacity building, and peer learning. While some supports are available to child welfare members, many resources are publicly available on our website, as well as a form to request TA and TA training that's available for our staff and consultant team. Our team will be dropping links in the chat in a moment where you can learn more about us on those provided. So please check it out and subscribe to our listserv if you'd like to learn more. Next slide, please. Over the past 8 years, PACT has developed a network of lived experience consultants who inform the work that we do. And it's because of their expertise that we have the training you will receive today. To learn more about our network and the training that we co-developed, please visit the links provided in the chat. And you'll see Solomon Masood, as well as others that have guided the work that we do across California. So with that, let's jump into today's topic. I am honored to introduce my colleague and co-presenter, Solomon Masood.
Thank you, Kelly. Hello, everyone. My name is Suleiman Masood. Thanks so much to PACT and for CalTrin for having me here. Really excited to talk about labor trafficking and ways that we can best support our underserved communities. I've worked in the anti-trafficking field for over 10 years now, where I've had the opportunity to support local, state, and federal agencies in finding ways to improve their anti-trafficking response. Specifically in how they can improve their victim service coordination, support, I would say aftercare, as well as prevention efforts. I now work as an attorney where I'm representing victims of various forms of crime, one of them being our underserved populations involving child sexual abuse, as well as survivors of sex trafficking, both minors and adults. I find ways to support them through civil litigation. I'm a survivor of labor trafficking, and I've always believed that those with the lived experience, as Kelly had mentioned, if they have the opportunity to work in this field, they really can be the best change makers and best advocates to lean on, because they have that internal and external knowledge on how to bridge the gaps and form more meaningful partnerships in our community. So what we will be covering today are three areas. First, we want to understand child labor trafficking and intersections within child sexual exploitation, understanding and knowing the signs and the stories behind them, and finally, how to respond through a more trauma-informed lens. To kind of get us, throughout the presentation, we're going to have some time for you all to answer some questions and reflect. Just as a way for us to better understand and build a foundation on labor trafficking and how your current agency's response to labor trafficking looks like. So the first question we want to ask you all is, what's your current knowledge of child labor trafficking? There should be a Zoom poll coming up, and I see you all answering now. Thank you. I'll give you all about a minute or so to answer. And I will also share, if there's anything that you want to respond in the chat, as far as some of the questions we might have or areas on the presentation, I'll do my best to review the chat and respond. So feel free to use our webinar chat and use the poll here as well.
Alrighty, I will go ahead and end the poll and share those results for you.
Thank you. So looks like the majority of the response here, 54% of you had shared that you're somewhat familiar on child labor trafficking. I've taken a class or two, familiar or learned from a lived experience. Excellent. All right. So moving us forward here, as part of that foundation building, and give some more kind of context to how labor trafficking could appear, what it looks like. I had the chance to work on a public service announcement with the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking. That was a state-funded organization who's still operating today. They're still doing some great work. For that area on the East Coast, they really wanted to find ways to better understand their community. So we came together to create a PSA. So I'll go ahead and we'll get that poster for you all so you have a chance to take a look. Thank you. Labor trafficking is a form of human trafficking that can happen to anyone, regardless of age, gender, culture, race, or citizenship status. Labor trafficking involves manual labor that can subject someone to long hours of work without breaks. Labor traffickers can recruit an individual to work by using threats, lies, or other types of manipulation to ensure that a worker does not report what is happening to them. Whether you are visiting farms in Atlantic County or dining in restaurants in Bergen County, labor trafficking can be seen in many different industries like gas stations, restaurants, hotels, farm working, or construction sites. It is not uncommon to see a manager or supervisor hovering over an employee or using threatening language when talking to someone at risk of labor trafficking. Examples of exploitive work conditions may include lack of personal protective equipment like masks, gloves, and goggles when using sharp objects, heavy lifting, or operating machinery. Victims of labor trafficking may appear in public settings with physical injuries, lack of proper hygiene, or feelings of fear. Types of labor trafficking may include domestic servitude, debt bondage, involuntary child labor, and other forms. Most victims of labor trafficking are not aware of their rights when working for an abusive employer. Regardless of your citizenship status, you have rights in this country. Everyone is entitled to back wages, overtime pay, or basic protective equipment. Every victim who is a non-citizen is eligible for continued presence, T visa, or U visa. Local consulates are available and willing to assist non-citizens in completing their visa documentation as well as understanding their human rights. Silence is not an option. If you are a victim of this form of abuse or you know someone whom you suspect of this, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 888-373-7888 or text HELP or INFO to 233-733. With your help, we can keep our communities safe. Thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and share back the screen. Do you all see that, my screen here? Okay, perfect. So when we think about labor trafficking, when I talk to communities across the country, many assume that labor trafficking does not happen here in the United States. Hopefully we can debunk that for you all today. But even just looking through a basic Google search of child labor trafficking, right? You see a lot of labor. You see that some of the most of the industries you're looking at here, right, look more like farm working, could look like construction, could look like mining. But there's so much more, so many different types of industries that intersect with labor trafficking, as we'll see. We have another poll for you that we'll launch here. Just to ask more foundation building with you all, what might the general public, as you all serve, who may come into your office, as you all might interact with in the community when you're doing your outreach events, what might the general public conclude about child labor trafficking? So to ask you all, who does it happen to? Where does it occur? And what industries might we expect to see it happen in?
And this one is going to be, I just want to let everybody know, all the participants, a short answer. So you can put in any of your thoughts or whatever, you can put them into your answer, and then I will end that poll and share out those results.
Thank you, Casey.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you, Casey. And you are welcome to also include that in our webinar chat as well, and I can take a look.
Yeah. And I see Amy's comment in the chat saying she can't see the polls on her phone. That is totally fine. I'll reread the question for you. And if you want to put your answer in the chat, we can do that as well. And so what might the general society or general public include about child labor trafficking from this Google search? So you can go ahead and put your answer to that question in the chat, Amy. I'm going to give everybody a few more minutes or a few more seconds to get their answers in, and then I'll go ahead and share that out.
Thank you, Casey.
Absolutely.
I think that it's also something to consider recently with AI generated images. Images are changing based on different algorithms that then repeat false narratives. And so that's something just to be mindful about as well. That we'll talk about in a moment.
Yep. Alrighty, sharing results now.
So Casey, when I see, it's
Mhm.
not showing any of the words. So you might just
Oh
have to
no.
read them out. It's just showing 27 people
Yeah.
answered. So thank
Oh,
you
okay.
for those
Yeah.
7. But if you don't mind reading, that'd be great.
Yeah. Let me take a look here. For some reason, it's not letting me see them either. So if we could, we'll do a switch here just for a second. If for everybody who answered your answers in that Q&A pod, if you could put your answers in the chat for me, that would be great. Just while I'm working on the back end to get everything fixed for these Q&A questions. Perfect. All righty, we see
And
some of
Karina,
those
I see
answers
your
coming in.
comment here in the fields. Hmm. Yep. Yep. Many of the children are immigrants, low-income families, that it only happens in foreign countries, only in poor countries, only happens in the agriculture industry. Yep. Yep. Happens to children of color, low-income families. Thank you, Karen. Yeah. General public usually has that disbelief that it's actually happening. Yeah, I mean, for the general public, I think really the extent to what they know is based on what's shared with them on social media or just, the traditional media, CNN, Fox News, CBS, whatever it may be. When you're hearing exploitation or you hear forced labor or you hear um, you know prostitution, sex work, all these different types of words that are shared, right? And then there you might see some graphic depiction of it. The assumption is based on whatever is going on in the news. Most recently, obviously, like the Diddy case, right? That one primarily involved sex trafficking. Whatever is going on in the media is often the what shapes the perception of someone from the general public. But as you all may understand, as many of you answered that you're somewhat familiar with labor trafficking, right? When we think of human trafficking as a whole, it encompasses multiple forms of exploitation, multiple forms that, as we'll go into the definitions and how it's defined federally, that force, fraud, and coercion are the types of elements, as we'll discuss later in this presentation, are what's needed to show how trafficking occurs. So I'm going to go ahead and close this here. Yeah, thank you, Cynthia. It would never happen to me. That is always seems to be the general assumption that it can only happen to a certain group of people. I'm going to go ahead and move us here. Um, so I'm thinking of some of those assumptions, right? Many of you answer that here. I appreciate it. It only happens in foreign countries. Other assumptions might be that it only impacts immigrants, only happens to adults, or services needed for sex versus labor trafficking are extremely different. Um, that this issue, for on the context of labor, for so long there have been criminal and civil litigation tied to labor exploitation, but it will only go to the extent of wage and hour theft. It will. It's. I think now starting to understand that based on if certain elements are met, wage and hour theft or wage and hour exploitation can graduate up to labor trafficking. Um, some of the I mentioned earlier, right? The media can often shape the perception of those that are learning about this topic. There was an excellent article that was written in the New York Times called "Alone and Exploited: Migrant Children Work Brutal Jobs Across the United States." There is a link at the bottom of this slide that will take you to that article. I encourage you all to read it if you're really trying to build your foundation and learn more about how labor exploitation occurs. But to summarize, the journalist had investigated and had interviewed several workers at a manufacturing plant out in Michigan, specifically near Grand Rapids, Michigan. There was a food packaging company called Heartside Food Solutions, um, where during COVID, you had many employees who are, I think, at the start of COVID, because we didn't know what was going on, there was so much of a change in our production. in the packaging, meat packing industries. And even like if you think of Amazon, right, the shipping and fulfillment in those types of warehouses, there was a giant shift. You know, it got to the point where because of stay-at-home orders, because of other types of restrictions, or even just for on a personal level, for those that didn't weren't coming in to these manufacturing jobs, you started seeing more layoffs occur. You started seeing a lot of job loss in that sector. So for these companies, from their point of view, they're running a business. They're not thinking about COVID. They're thinking of ways that they can capitalize, unfortunately, on the pandemic, and ways in which they can make sure that their production is meeting the demand. On the demand side is us as in consumers, people that are buying products, personal protective equipment at that time, hand sanitizer, masks, right, food, other types of products that you might be buying on your phone or online. And to meet that fulfillment, to meet that demand, you had a lot of manufacturers and manufacturing companies and packaging companies taking shortcuts where they were hiring young children to come in. If you all might recall, between during and after COVID, you were seeing an influx in migrant youth crossing the border from parts of Mexico, from parts of Honduras, Guatemala, even above from Canada. You know, different populations were coming into the United States, and there was a pretty large population of youth that were coming in. So you had children working in these manufacturing jobs, and we'll talk more about how that has presented and in what industries that's presented in. But this article does a great job explaining how harsh those conditions and what they look like, and the hours that these youth were working in. So I want to share, and if there's anything that you take away from this presentation, or at least from my talking points, one of the things I really want to make clear is when we think of labor exploitation and we think of forced labor, this is not a new concept here in the United States. It might be new, maybe in terms of how it's being marketed or how it's being discussed across other several issues. But when we think of child labor in the United States, it has foundations to this country's founding. If you see here, prior to 1938, there was a census that showed 1 in 8 children were employed. In 1911, 2 million children were working in factories and mass production. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was passed. I just want to talk real quick about a case that solidified the Fair Labor Standards Act. And that case is United States v. Darby. For anybody that might be familiar with that case, it was a significant U.S. Supreme Court case that standardized really what our work week and what our working rights look like. It was one of the earliest adoptions of that. So the background behind that is Fred Darby was a Georgia lumber manufacturer. He was charged with violating the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLISA, by paying workers below the minimum wage and requiring excessive hours without overtime pay. A lot of those workers were children. In court, he had argued that the federal government had no authority to regulate manufacturing practices within that state of Georgia. So the Supreme Court ruled, and they ruled unanimously in favor of the United States government. So the party that's obviously enforcing the Fair Labor Standards Act, they had found that Congress had a broad power under the Commerce Clause. That basically just means it's one of the constitutional rights of commerce to go in and out of a state, across state lines. And one of the Congress's powers was being able to enforce labor conditions, like regulations around labor conditions that might have affected commerce. So ultimately, this was a major victory for federal labor regulations. This is why we have the minimum wage. This is why we have overtime protections, why we have personal protective equipment authorized to us if we're working in a hazardous environment. These are the types of things you all may have heard or seen from the Department of Labor. This is the part of this is the federal agency and the executive part of the executive branch that's enforcing this law. And moving from 1938 and this court case moving all the way through our current time, right? 28 states since 2021 introduced bills to weaken child labor laws. Once again, finding ways that these corporations might be able to cut corners and hire children. Now, you might be thinking, in a manufacturing job like that, there has to be some audits, there has to be some compliance that some of these manufacturers and corporations, they have to follow. The way that some of these corporations have gotten around it is hiring these children during graveyard shifts, hiring them at certain points when they might be tipped off that an audit might be coming, or following an audit, having these children come back to work these graveyard shifts. Many of these children, as covered in that New York Times article we had discussed, they're having them work in more janitorial spaces within that warehouse. So if you see a bunch of sod on the ground, if you see a bunch of plastic, other types of packaging materials on the ground, the role of this child is to make sure that they're inspecting the warehouse floor, they're cleaning up after it, and they're using, unfortunately, toxic chemicals, such as everyday cleaners or industrial cleaners to clean the machinery. So, as I mentioned, the COVID pandemic raised those concerns around child labor, and some of the justification that these children are having to work, right, from their perspective, is that they're trying to bring money for their family. If they were able to cross into the United States and work within the United States, their family may be back home. So having that responsibility put on them at such a very young age to work in this environment, make whatever you can under the table, falsify your documentation, to make sure that you pass the third party staffing compliance, make that money and send it through a MoneyGram, TransUnion, or other means. There was an investigation that took place by the Department of Labor for Purdue Farms out in Virginia, where one of these kids, it was a young boy in Virginia who was working the graveyard shift at as you all know, Purdue Farms, they do a lot of chicken slicing. So it's a meat packing plant. They do a lot of slicing of the chicken and into different parts and packaging it. So the child was walking the warehouse floor one night. He saw a cartilage of that chicken caught on near one of the slicers. The child reached in to try to clean it. Didn't really realize the machine was still on. As he was reaching, the slicer came and it severed his arm. And this was something that, again, the company was trying to keep under wraps because they knew that they weren't supposed to hire that child in the first place. Going back to my earlier point here, this is a very strong quote coming from Nola Brantley. She's a prominent subject matter expert on human trafficking out in California, where she comments on how trafficking is consistent with the lens of historical oppression. So, similar to sex trafficking, it is necessary to understand labor trafficking through an intersectional lens of historical oppression. It began in the United States during colonization with indentured servitude and continued throughout history with African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Latinos, and immigrants forced into labor to build the country we have today. As I mentioned, there are various degrees of labor that we see here in the United States, coming from legal child labor all the way through labor trafficking. So just to go through this spectrum with you all, legal child labor, it's the type of labor that is authorized by the state and by the federal government, where you're typically 14 to 16 years old. So this might be that job that you might see where that minor is working in fast food, or they might be working in sports, so sports leagues, so specifically like refereeing or coaching. Some exceptions to the 14 to 16-year-old age range may come in the entertainment industry, so child acting, child modeling, that sort of thing. You might see agriculture, family businesses as well. But the age range varies by the state and the industry. Child labor, it's defined by minors under the legal working age that are engaging in illegal work and or work that is harmful to their health, development, or education. When we start now moving toward the side around exploitation, labor exploitation can be seen as working legally but denied basic legal rights, such as fair compensation, or fair like enough breaks, having multiple breaks at a time, especially if you're working more than 6 hours, um, or having access to overtime pay. However, youth may have the freedom to move or leave that employment. Now, labor trafficking, that's where you're seeing that very restrictive um, environment from their employer. So this is where labor trafficking, as we'll define it in a second, it often has components of child labor and child labor exploitation. But the key difference between labor trafficking and labor exploitation is that force, fraud, or coercion must be present. And now I'll turn it over to Kelly.
Thank you, Solomon. Um, if you wouldn't mind going back a slide to define, unless it got skipped, but uh, one more, please. And then back one more. I'm hoping to show the Trafficking Victims Protection Act definition because human trafficking was defined about 26
Yes,
years
I
ago.
am not.
If not, I can talk through it and then we can uh
Yeah, we might need to talk through this. I'm not seeing the slide here.
no worries. Um so I will get to coercion in a moment because this is an important element to defining exploitation and trafficking as a whole. Um It should be right before this one, Solomon, but if it's somehow missing, that is okay. Perfect.
Sorry about that. Should be up now.
Thank you. No worries. So as you can see here is the federal definition of both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act defined human trafficking in the United States about 26 years ago, effectively being able to describe this crime in court so that prosecutions could take place and services could be provided to victims. However, when it comes to how a person is being exploited by their trafficker, there is often no distinction when it comes to the abuse, meaning that oftentimes a child who is being sex trafficked may also be forced or coerced into performing other forms of labor or services that profit their trafficker. So the law separates labor and sex trafficking, and traffickers do not. You can see here that labor trafficking, as defined by the TVPA, states that it is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjugation to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Next slide, please. So these are some examples, just a few, of what force, fraud, or coercion can look like in a labor trafficking situation and how they're used to keep a child or a young adult within the control of their trafficker. So when we think of force, we often go to like a restraint, but it could also be that there is total freedom of movement, yet starvation tactics are keeping someone constrained. Psychological coercion and believing the lies or the fraud that are promised, such as false promises about the type of work or the hours worked or the type of job. False documents. How would you know that those are false documents as a youth if no one told you? You only know what you know. And many youth are trusting of their so-called employer as they are believing these fraudulent contracts. And that leads to coercion. Coercion is key when it comes to any trafficking situation. When someone is trafficked for labor or services, it looks similar to those who may be trafficked for commercial sexual exploitation. Um, and in coercion, that could look like those threats to loved ones. It could look like gaslighting and manipulation, um, normalizing abuse and normalizing behaviors. Threats to migration or immigration status, even using criminal history or criminal behavior as a means to control an individual. Um, Here you can see that coercion is defined as any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that failure to act would result in serious harm or physical restraint, threat or serious harm of physical restraint against a person, or abuse or threatened abuse of a legal process. Um, Solomon, can you share with us a little more about the elements of proof needed for minors or about coercion?
Yes, yes, thank you. Um, when we think about sex trafficking, I think the key word here is around commercial sex activity or sexual conduct, right? When we think about minors in that context, I think it's clear that minors cannot consent to sex based on how the law is written, based on how we look at, how society deems it and how court cases have found rulings around it. Any type of sex act where a perpetrator is coercing a minor into a sex act, it's automatically deemed, there isn't a need to show proof of force, fraud, or coercion if they're able to show that it was a commercial sex act was provided or was given. When we think about labor, this is where we see that kind of gap. And just going back really quick to the spectrum of child labor, just going down here, when we think about labor, we often think of what type of work authorization is a child required to have in order to work in that environment. What type of industry can that minor work in? And that's defined by state regulation as well as federal guidelines that are provided. So, for example, I gave the example around working in a warehouse, right? A child, depending on the state, a child may not be authorized to be operating heavy machinery or working around hazardous materials or hazardous chemicals. If they have continued exposure to that, right, that might be in violation of that state regulation that authorizes that child to work. But where the difference between sex trafficking and labor trafficking lie is where we understand that a minor cannot consent to sex. The law is written in a way where a minor can consent to working, and they may consent to be even in a exploitive environment. But it is on the litigator, whether the prosecutor or the attorney or even in law enforcement that's investigating, that must be able to show that while that minor was working in that environment, they were subject to either force, fraud, or coercion. Where the fraud may occur is where I gave that example of that if a minor is coming into a warehouse and they're going through the process of onboarding, where they have to show that they have proof to work, some of that information can be falsified. When we think about identification, for example, if a child is, let's say, 12 years old, but the minimum age that the state authorizes that child to work in that warehouse is 16, that child may be obtaining false identification, right? They may be falsifying a passport or falsifying a driver's license and other materials to demonstrate that they're of age, right, to work in that environment. Um, when we think of even just in terms of minors and adults that may be permitted to have a visa, right? So thinking of a T visa or a U visa, um, where some of that falsification can also occur is if that individual, if that individual is coming into the United States and their employer is encouraging them to set up a bank account, right, to create direct deposit, that employer may be falsifying their identity, maybe falsifying certain documentation, or being added as a co-owner of that bank account in order to monitor the transactions. So under the law, the way that it's written, a in order to be added to a bank account, any individual, minor or adult, they must provide written authorization that they consent to having their passport held by the employer if they're asking for it, and they must also consent to being on the bank account in order for that bank account to be valid. If they're not, that could be a form of that fraud. And again, that coercion is that information that Kelly shared, the definition. It also applies to labor, where it's putting that individual in a position where they feel that they cannot. Sorry, I'm getting it up here. Putting them in a position where there is an abuse or threatened abuse of a legal process, where the employer is threatening to deport them, threatening to have them arrested because they might have some affiliation with the Department of Labor. But the reality behind that relationship between the employer and the Department of Labor is that they're just authorizing the visas, right? Where they're applying to the Department of Labor and telling the Department of Labor, hey, for this harvesting season or for this stretch of employment, the scope of that employment is defined, and the number of employees that are working in that environment is also defined and listed, and that is what is shared with the Department of Labor. But obviously, the employee doesn't know that, right? They only know that based on the employer's claims that, hey, I have this relationship with this agent from the Department of Labor. He may come through audits, and if you're not in compliance or if you're not working or doing your part, we will have him come and arrest you, or have you, there might be additional threats to the individual and their family. So to kind of give some examples on kind of the types of labor trafficking that might exist, one being here domestic servitude in hotels. We have a video to help demonstrate that, and we'll discuss together. So this is Sophia's story, and this was created by Framework.
Sophia is 16 and from El Salvador. She has been separated from her mother and younger brothers for the last 6 months. She was initially excited to be in the US and with her aunt, but things have gotten difficult. Sometimes her aunt showers her with love and makes her favorite homemade foods. Other times, she makes Sophia feel guilty and ashamed for being a financial burden. She says that Sophia owes it to her and to her family to work as a maid at a fancy hotel instead of going to school. Sophia's aunt keeps the money, though she says she sends some to Sophia's family. When Sophia's aunt gets mad, she says that she'll throw Sophia out.
Thank you for that. I'm just going to get us sharing again. Just give me one moment. Thank you. What was given in that vignette, right, is the lack of freedom of choice. It's where Sophia is working in the hotel industry. You have to think of, these are everyday, and this is where when we think of labor exploitation or force or labor trafficking, when people tell me that they don't see it, right? The sad reality is there are instances of labor trafficking and labor exploitation that happen right in front of us, but because we don't understand the signs, the type of abuse, or the lack of recognition of the industries and where it occurs, this is where it becomes difficult for survivors to come forward, right, or victims. When we think of the hotel industry, right, this is a very busy kind of work environment, right? There's so many layers of managers, there's so many layers of employees and staff, where someone like Sophia, right, might be cleaning after the rooms after somebody's checking out of that hotel, right? Or may be asked to assist in, if a hotel's offering free breakfast, right? Offering some of the hospitality services there. These are everyday people that you're seeing, but if you're not seeing the signs right in front of you, right? This is where that message can be lost around whether labor trafficking exists in this country or not. And I can assure you, as we go into some of the data around the national hotline, it does occur, and I think Kelly will touch more on the assumptions that may exist when it comes to data. Go ahead, Kelly.
Thank you, Solomon. Before I do so, I'd like to address Dr. Carley. Go ahead.
Thanks, Kelly. There was a question in the chat for you, Solomon. If an employee is told that overtime is mandatory, is this considered labor exploitation?
It can be, but it depends on the industry and it depends on the on the scope of the work that was provided in that employer contract, right? If and it also depends on the age of that worker. If that worker is a minor, there are far stricter requirements around overtime pay as opposed to somebody that's working as an adult. But if the overtime is authorized within the employee contract, but the amount of hours is outside that scope, then it is possible that employer is violating worker protective laws based on the state Department of Labor as well as the federal.
Thank you. So we have some data that we'd like to share. In 2019, the National Human Trafficking Hotline provided a report on trends since its inception in 2007. So that was over a 12-year time span, indicating that although child labor was identified, there were still lower numbers of reports. And although there was an increase in the percentage of cases reported 4 years later in 2023, that shows growth in reporting. We know that could possibly be attributed to more public awareness and understanding. We still anticipate that this is highly underreported. In 2023, the National Human Trafficking Hotline also shifted from counting the numbers of individuals to case numbers, meaning that multiple people could be represented in one case number. And it's common to see multiple victims in labor trafficking cases. So in 2023, minors made 23% of National Human Trafficking Hotline cases, which means there were multiple individuals identified out of that 23% of cases. Next slide, please. So similar to commercial sexual exploitation, this data confirms that it is through personal relationships that someone is exploited, which causes us to consider how it is only by relationships that a youth will begin to recover. The most common relationship type to the trafficker is the child's family member or someone else that they know. Next slide, please. Here are risk factors that were reported by the youth. These are some risk factors which youth reported added to their vulnerabilities of being labor trafficked. If we consider the risk factors of, let's say, the loss of an economic provider in the home, for some youth, working is not a choice, it's a necessity. And it's very difficult for a minor to find a job that pays well with very little experience or knowledge of their workers' rights. If you think about your very first job, I think back to my first job, I was very unaware of what my worker rights were. And most youth have that vulnerability to being exploited through force, fraud, or coercion by that trusted adult or peer. I also want to note on here some of the intersections, such as unstable housing and immigration or migration status, economic impacts, and physical health. Next slide, please. So this data shows that a higher number for national labor trafficking indicates the vulnerabilities of our immigrant youth, but also may reflect a lack of understanding regarding what labor trafficking looks like among US citizen youth. So higher unknowns may demonstrate a fear to disclose your citizenship status, as well as the data that's being reported, whether that's self-reported or by others, is through the awareness of those that are reporting. So if they're only looking for foreign national youth versus US citizen youth, there could be disproportionate numbers displayed. And the fear to disclose would prevent others from providing that information as well. Next slide, please. Did you want to comment, Suleiman, on any of this data? I'm so sorry, I did not pause to ask you that.
No, no, it's no problem. The only thing I will say, as you're looking through some of these, some of the statistics here and some of the charting, right? You want to think back to, I asked you all, right? As you take time to absorb this information and reflect, if you're having internal discussions within your agency on whether labor trafficking has been reported, or instances of labor exploitation are being reported in your community, right? If the answer to that is no, you should not assume that labor trafficking does not exist. It just means, again, back to Kelly's point, right? There's a lack of education on what is constituted as coercion, force, or fraud.
Thank you, Suleiman. And I appreciate that you started us with kind of checking our bias or our assumptions at the beginning. Likewise, I think gender is often disproportionate, or kind of shows that there may be a lack of understanding. This data set, it was from a study done in Florida. So a similar 2013 to 2017 data set of 6,000 allegations from the Department of Child and Families in Florida found child victims of labor trafficking were 9 times more likely to be male than with sex trafficking. Now, that could show that there's some bias in the assessment, as well as the types of industries that individuals look to for labor trafficking. Go ahead, Solomon.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, every industry is different, and it's based on what are the needs in that community. When you think of the Southwest, so that being California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, right, there might be a higher likelihood that labor exploitation or labor trafficking could exist in the agriculture or construction or restaurant industries, because that's where a lot of there's a higher influx of those types of industries within that area. Whereas when you think of Alaska, for example, or Maine, they have a very large fishing and cannery industry, where forced labor may take place not in the fields, but on a boat, right, where there's fishing, and then into the manufacturing side where there's canning. But obviously, with anything, right, in this country, right, every state has its own unique set of needs and unique types of industries used to drive the economy in that area.
Thank you. We can go to the next slide. So we also want to recognize that the vast majority of identified individuals in the US are people of color. And we must recognize that due to systemic oppression in the US, or the vast majority, are people within the Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities across our nation. And I want to recognize that as a white woman, I had to be intentional to listen and to learn about a reality that was different than my own. And I want to encourage others who may feel like they can't relate or they aren't sure what they can do to lean in and to stay humble and ask how you can partner well with those whose realities just may look different than your own. Next slide, please. Unless, Suleiman, you'd like to share. You shared a wonderful quote by Nola earlier that I think reflected that, but is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, when you have, we'll get into this probably more toward the end of our presentation, but when we think of the types of institutions, right, that are funded to support those that may be at risk or those that may be victims of trafficking and looking to report, right? You just want to understand, right? For those people of color, right, that have not maybe intersected with these systems such as child welfare or have not intersected with hospitals or the local police department, out of maybe fear of retaliation or out of fear of their employer and how their employer might react, or the fear of losing their opportunity, their job opportunity. The systems that, as I mentioned in that quote with Nola, right? The systems have provided, inherent disparities for people of color. So that helps for us to understand why there's so much hesitancy to report what's going on. So again, just keeping it in mind, right? When you don't see labor trafficking being reported, it's not because it doesn't exist. It's because there are other factors at play that may prevent somebody from reporting.
It's a wonderful point. Thank you, Solomon. As you can see on this slide here, these are some commonly reported venues. And just as Solomon had mentioned, we're just at the tip of the iceberg, really, and understanding in some ways certain industries and how exploitation is taking place here in the US for children. So some of the industries where child trafficking occurs can overlap or be integrated. Labor trafficking occurs in both formal settings, within restaurants, retail spaces, etc., and more informal settings such as babysitting, panhandling, domestic work. Some of the examples on the screen, as you can see here, overlap, but it's by no means an exhaustive list. However, bearing in mind that traffickers use any means necessary, there are places where overlap, places of overlap which occur within labor trafficking that are illegal, and this would be referred to as forced criminality. So when a minor is committing crimes which profit the trafficker, this can look like recruiting other peers or drug production, drug sales, drug cultivation, petty theft. That is labor trafficking by forced criminality. And there is a quote here by a PACT consultant, Jess Torres, who speaks on this very well. And it says, people often think there's a clear-cut experience of trafficking when a trafficker doesn't care how you make money or how they are extracting a profit. For example, a trafficker could have someone stripping, selling sex, panhandling, working a regular job, or stealing simultaneously. So child labor trafficking can be formal work or informal work as well as forced criminality.
Yeah. One industry that I want to raise that we oftentimes don't necessarily think where trafficking could happen would also be for those that may be incarcerated. So thinking of jail and prison, as well as juvenile detention centers, where we see sex trafficking and labor trafficking more publicly. This is an industry, or I would say an area of concern where, because it's not public, there may be more instances where sex or forced labor may occur. When you see the overlap between sex trafficking or labor trafficking, just one more thing I want us to keep in mind. We talk about some of the risk factors that may exist for somebody that may be subjected to sex trafficking or for labor trafficking. One of those vulnerabilities may be the immigration status. I really want you all, hopefully, please, just to keep in mind, when you think of either sex trafficking or labor trafficking, you should not be thinking of it, especially in labor trafficking, not thinking of it as only an immigration issue. If we get into that level of thinking, then we start creating more profiling. When we get into the sense of that labor trafficking or sex trafficking are human issues, it puts us at a space where we can better understand that anyone can be at risk of being trafficked or exploited. Oftentimes, when we think of sex trafficking, especially among children, with the way that the media depicts it, it's depicted in a way where it does not matter how it happened, who it happened to, why it happened. It's those service providers that are acting quick and understanding that, hey, a child was harmed. Let's get this child and his or her family or their family the attention that they need and the immediate safety. When we think of labor trafficking and depicted in the media, we often see some attachment around an immigration status and the uncertainty around whether assistance can be provided or not. But if we look at it more broadly as a human issue, it allows us to put the biases in check and find ways to support those populations.
And Solomon, just a quick time check. I think we should skip the next video as we can share that in the chat and go to the Covenant House slide.
Sure.
Which I think is,
Do you see
I
it
don't know.
up?
Yes. Is that mine or yours? I'm sorry.
I'm happy to take it. It's no problem. There was a study done by Covenant House where they wanted to better understand the interviews and some of the youth around how they may have been identified and how some of these vulnerabilities and some of even just exploitation has been reported. So the Covenant House study found that 1 in 5 identified as victims of some form of trafficking. 91% of youth reported being offered lucrative work opportunities that turned out to be fraudulent, scams, or sex trafficking. Within that study, where they interviewed this youth, they found that 23% of the youth with a foster care history were trafficked. In Oakland, California, for example, labor trafficking was more prevalent than sex trafficking. In LA, Los Angeles, 50% was found to be subjected to forced labor, while 50% were subjected to be victims of sex trafficking. Yes, these are high stats. And again, it's an opportunity for us to take a broad look at how it's being reported versus how it's being reported through studies as opposed to how it's being reported in the media. And the study found that the majority, 81% of labor trafficking, was forced criminality, so forced drug dealing. And LGBTQIA plus youth were twice as likely to experience trafficking. Thinking through on some of the recruitment methods here, you know, there are multiple ways that youth are that youth can be communicated or approached. Much more than many of us growing up. You have social media, you have the internet, and the very various amount of apps, Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, where communication is frequently provided, right? You have, in the labor context, you have job opportunities and job postings given through WhatsApp, given through, again, Meta, so being Instagram, Facebook, also through Indeed and Craigslist. Sometimes you have staffing agencies that are, I'll say traffickers or exploiters that are disguising themselves as these staffing agencies where they're reaching out directly to these youth or young adults. They're putting them in situations where they are having this grand opportunity where they can come in, they can work, they can save that money, or they can provide that money back to their family. They get all these benefits. They get overtime pay. They get time off. All of these different types of recruitment strategies that you see here are similar to what we may see for adults. For word of mouth, I will just comment here. This is where it can be a little bit harmful because it's the community may be seeing what we might see as labor exploitation or labor trafficking for a certain community may see it as a way of life. So what do I mean by that? Again, exploitation looks different in different parts of the world and even different parts of the United States. Simple example I can give you is I worked for the United States Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. This was a platform that gave those with lived experience a platform at the federal stage to provide formal recommendations to the federal government. One of the responsibilities we had was taking a regional trip to understand the different types of exploitation and those service providers that are there to support that community. What we found in Alaska, for example, whether in both the indigenous communities and outside of the reservation, and you found in the canning and in the fishing industry, you had multi-generational farmers, multi-generational fishers, where the father, the uncle, the grandfather, the nephew, and the son all worked together on the boat where they were fishing. And the employer is putting them all in a position where they weren't getting any breaks because they're out all day and there's only a short window where the amount of fish could be caught, specifically salmon. Putting them in a position where they had very little breaks, they had very little pay. So even if the pay was advertised through some of these recruitment methods I mentioned, they're not actually getting that paid, or their pay is getting docked because maybe there are being mistakes being made on the job. And if they're working more than 8 hours, they're not getting overtime pay. Specifically in the indigenous communities, many who continue to work in that environment, they saw it as an opportunity to provide for their family and not raise any questions out of fear of retaliation or the fear of losing that job opportunity. Coming into the mainland here, working in farms, in farm working, we also see that same parallel with, maybe the families coming into the United States where the father, the mother are working in agriculture, and the son and the nephew or the cousin are coming to support their parents in that farm working for that larger employer, being, whoever it may be, where, the fear of losing this opportunity to have that money take home and use that money to provide for the family, it's rather seen as a way of life. So these trafficking risks that we're talking about, they occur long before a child arrives in the United States. It can start in their home country with poverty, violence, or family separation, which already starts and builds on those vulnerabilities I mentioned. On the journey to the United States, minors are often dependent on those smugglers or coyotes, or they're strangers for safety as they're coming from their home country into the United States. That dependence on that employer and that even just that opportunity of that, again, that quote unquote American dream that may or may not exist where we are right now. This dependence can be exploited through forced labor, through sexual violence, or manipulation through some of those recruitment tactics I had showed you on the last slide. At the border, children may face confusion, fear, or lack of protection. The gaps in screening and safe placement create opportunities for these traffickers to step in. Once these children and their families are inside the United States, these children can be funneled into labor or sexual exploitation by those who offered to help or work. You get that, as I mentioned in the recruitment tactics, you might have got that WhatsApp message offering this short-term employment. We'll put you on this T visa or U visa to come work in this factory or work in the farm. Understanding that journey, it helps us see that trafficking is not as a single event, but it's a process with multiple points, right? So the trafficker may have helped them falsify their identification. That trafficker may have helped them get that bank account I'd mentioned. That trafficker may have put them in a position where, hey, now that you're here, I will provide you some housing. It's just, across the street from the farm or from the work site, or maybe a few blocks, but I will provide the transportation to and from. And any groceries that you want to buy, just let me know. Write a list of the types of food that you might want, and I will bring it for you. If the staffing agency or the employer is providing all of these different types of services to this worker or the child, it's putting them in a position where they're allowing. Well, I shouldn't say allowing. They're empowering this employer or exploiter to put them where they can be surveilled or monitored at every aspect. So before work starts, after work starts, and in between. So this should help serve as a reminder that uh, looking at these risk factors early, especially when we're working with migrant and unaccompanied minors, can help prevent continued exploitation. So human trafficking for forced criminality, it can be a form of forced labor or services. So forced criminality is a form of labor trafficking, as we had mentioned. Children who are exploited to commit crimes for someone else's profit or protection. We gave the example on drug trafficking or drug muling, right, where there are lesser penalties, where youth may be cited or committing crimes or may be placed in juvenile detention. For the trafficker, that's seen as a larger benefit as opposed to having an adult perform a similar job only to be penalized more harshly. Many youth involved in these acts are not choosing that crime. They're being coerced, threatened, or manipulated, often to serve or protect loved ones. So the example around drug muling may come from gang membership or some type of association that a family member may have. It might be an uncle, it may be a father, it might be a cousin, or an older brother that is really encouraging this child to take on this risk, right? To take on this role. And as I mentioned before, right, the type of work being exploited is not seen as exploitation or a lack of rights. It's being seen as a way of life, right? It's a part of normal living, a normal upkeep. So those types of examples I mentioned, right, where peer recruitment occurs is where kids are being pressured to bring in friends or siblings. Scams like fraud or identity theft, or even the theft of property or cars. Some are pushed into gang activity, drug smuggling, selling, or using weapons to enforce control. Others are forced to commit benefits where we see fraud or loiter to sell drugs or other goods. These children are often criminalized instead of being recognized as victims. And if they continue to be put in the system and they continue to be penalized harshly and we're put in a position where they're tried as adults in certain jurisdictions, it makes it much harder for them to get the help. Puts them in a position where they feel like they are the perpetrator more than the victim, where that if they're being told that they're victims of trafficking, if that intervention is not provided early, they will never see themselves as this quote unquote victim based on the kind of expectations put on them and the type of manipulation that was ingrained in them. So our response really needs to shift. It's identifying that exploitation behind the illegal activity and connect kids to safety and support, not punishment. It goes back to kind of that example I gave. Regardless of the type of trafficking that we see, right, we shouldn't attach a label or an origination behind it. When we think of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, forced criminality, you're not thinking of forced criminality as of this individual being a criminal, or you're not thinking of forced labor as somebody being just an immigrant, or it's an immigration issue or a criminal issue. You're really seeing it first broadly as a human issue. Potential indicators, you all may have already picked up on this through some of the examples that we've provided and some of the information thus far. But when we think of minors who may be potential victims, right, some of the indicators that we see is where the child is malnourished or fatigued. There are untreated work-related injuries where they're brought into a clinic or they're brought into a hospital, but they're not wanting to report, or they may lie about how they were injured. There are ties to gangs, drugs, or criminal activities. There's debt bondage, other signs of abuse that we may see. I talked earlier around passport confiscation, and other driver's license confiscation, right? You're controlling these documents, you're controlling their money through being a co-owner on the bank accounts. Again, by law, if an employer is holding their bank account information, or they're holding their passport, or they're holding their driver's license or other type of identification, there must be some form of written authorization from that worker authorizing their employer to hold that. If that's not there, that could be that trigger that element of fraud within the labor trafficking context. Kelly, I'm going to bring this back to you.
Thank you, Solomon. Speaking of indicators, PAC developed an indicator chart that was informed by a review of existing tools and input from community providers, leaders with lived expertise, and others within the child welfare network. This chart, it highlights commonly observed signs and potential overlaps where intersectional experiences may occur. So we will put a link in the chat, or if you are already pulling your phone out to scan the QR code, you can access this within our publications page to view as a training tool. It's a great introductory tool to learn more, and it's a great educational resource. And so we just wanted to provide that for you to access as well. Next slide, please. So screening tool recommendations. Some recommendations that we would have, some questions are here on the screen. And when possible, PACT encourages the use of a fully integrated tool that screens for both CSE or commercial sexual exploitation and child labor trafficking, given the frequent intersections between the two, which by now I hope that you have a better understanding of that intersectionality. And However, in some cases, you might not have the ability to implement a screening tool yet. And I think that it's good to remember to be open to conversations with young people around their job situations and asking open-ended questions and providing safe space without judgment to build trust as they share about their work experiences. And most importantly, want you to think about if you are considering implementing a screening tool, the questions here to ask yourself. Is it user-friendly? Is it evidence-based or peer-reviewed? Is it trauma-informed? Is the language being used trauma-informed and youth-centered? And is it universally applicable? We have biases even within screening situations. And so can this be applied no matter how who is using this screening tool to better mitigate those biases? And is there that integration of labor trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation so that we are asking the right questions to better identify youth that may be labor trafficked? An example that we have within our publications page that is available for you as well. Although while there's multiple tools, one quick tool that we developed as an add-on for labor trafficking specifically is available for you. And this guide highlights commonly observed signs and potential indicators of labor trafficking. It's designed to be used with an existing screening process to help fill gaps where fully integrated screening tools may be limited. And then on the next slide, there are a couple questions that were provided from a screening tool that has been validated, and it's the quick youth screening indicator. And there's two questions that you can ask. The first question would be, is the alleged victim providing labor or services for another person? And there's some examples in the bullet points here. And that could be formally or informally. We talked about illegal activities, but that general providing labor or services to anyone else, if you're yes, no, or unsure. Solomon, please feel free to chime in if you would like at any point. And the next question on that quick screening tool is, does the alleged victim appear to be compelled in any way to provide those labor or services? That compelled element goes back to our conversation on coercion and feeling that there is a compulsion to provide that labor or services. That shows up in a variety of ways. It could look like missing school to perform that labor or to go to work or to babysit informally, which is a work position to that youth. It could look like knowing that there is a debt that their family has incurred and they feel compelled to pay off said debt, or being afraid that something bad will happen to them or someone else that they love if they stop working. Solomon, did you want to comment on any of this? I saw you
No, this
unmuted.
is the straightforward information, and it's just a gentle reminder, right? As you all have strong expertise and knowledge around case management and working with different types of youth, we when we think through on some of the screening, we never want to get into that why, right? Why somebody is working in this environment, why they were put in this situation, right? Or why didn't they, even if they're in an employment setting, why didn't you go and call the police, or why didn't you go and ask for help? But just a gentle reminder, right? The same way that we apply that through sex trafficking, and we're working with that type of youth, we're wanting to do the same thing, right? Avoid the why.
Great reminder. Thank you. I think we can move on.
So, in thinking through about our response, I want us to pause here with a quote. Speaks really well to understanding vulnerabilities and kind of what we've discussed here. But this comes from Brene Brown. Of all the things trauma takes away from us, the worst is our willingness or even our ability to be vulnerable. There's a reclaiming that has to happen. Trauma often takes away a person's sense of safety and their ability to trust, especially when it comes to children and immigrant youth. For these types of populations who've experienced trafficking, that vulnerability has often been used against them, where they're forced to trust these adults and trust that they're going to have their best interests for them. As professionals, we can help create spaces where vulnerability is safe again, where young people feel that they can be believed, respected, and supported. Healing is not only about physical safety, it's about restoring a person's voice and their right to show up fully without fear. Trauma has psychological, emotional, physical, health, and spiritual impacts. When we think about youth in particular, the type of trauma that they experience, especially in their earliest development, it affects their brain chemistry, and that brain chemistry, whether it being a TBI, a traumatic brain injury, or the physical effects that have occurred as a result of that trafficking activity, this is something that could be a long-term symptom that exists as of following their victimization, where it has long-lasting effects much through their adulthood. Physical effects, as I mentioned, can involve malnutrition, lack of hygiene, but in thinking of kind of the long-term effects, that those triggers, the panic attacks, the anxiety, and PTSD, it's not something that can just go away. It's something that you have to deal and treat throughout that child's life. As we covered this, but the barriers to disclosure or leaving really come through the trauma bond with the trafficker, the fear of the trafficker, the fear of retaliation, especially for immigrant youth, the fear that their job opportunity may be compromised or jeopardized. And this is where us as practitioners really have to keep in mind in the labor context, and even in sex trafficking. We have to take a step back and ask if this child is still involved in this employer-employee relationship and they're still being exploited. Would taking that child out of that situation improve or worsen their situation? For many populations, many families that are victimized through labor trafficking, if that one job opportunity is taken away, would that harm the family at large who may be back home, or other members that they have to support, where they have no choice but to find another employer where they're willing to be exploited again? So thinking through on the kind of pros and cons of taking that individual, immediately taking that individual out of that exploitive situation is something we really should be thinking through. This is a quote coming from a strong survivor leader, male victim of sex trafficking, a male survivor who's a strong expert on these issues around male victimization and trafficking at large. Russell Wilson. Russell states that the journey from surviving to thriving is not a straight line, it's a roller coaster. Survivors of trauma often take inconsistent leaps forward as well as big steps backwards. So in the same way that we support our adult population, understanding that youth can take multiple steps forward but also multiple steps backwards. Um, before diving into trauma work, we must first stabilize basic needs, as I mentioned. So that can look like safety, housing, food, and health. Without those basic needs, that healing really isn't possible. A key part of recovery is helping young people reclaim the joy of childhood. Simple things like play, safety, and trust rebuild their sense of self and hope. And I do recognize we are at time here. I'm just going to quickly wrap up. But today we explored child labor trafficking, what it is, and how it impacts children's safety and well being. We discussed how to recognize the signs and red flags from work conditions to control, fear, and isolation. We looked at the stories behind these signs, reminding us that these are real people with complex lives, not just the risk factors that we're checking a box on. Finally, we covered how to respond to safety, where it's building trust, connecting with multidisciplinary partners, and knowing where to refer and report. Moving forward, we want to stay alert for those potential indicators. As Kelly had shared, using the screening tools and local resources to help guide our response. We want to build relationships and trust and understand that when we're building those relationships, that trust and disclosure, it does take time. Each of us here have a role in prevention and response. Even the small actions, as far as asking a caring question, connecting a child to help, sharing what you've learned, can protect and support kids. At the end of the day, kids want to know that they're in an environment where they feel like they can be trusted and supported. So as a follow-up with your program, with the agencies you work on, you want to follow up and ask, do you suspect child labor trafficking might be involved in past cases at your organization? You want to ask, does your intake, data collection, outreach materials, protocols for services cover both sex and labor trafficking for your organization? If not, follow up with leadership to ensure these are updated. And a final reflection question is, are these the types of cases or situations you may encounter in the future where trafficking may potentially be involved? As mentioned throughout the chat, we have our resources that we've shared with you. These are just some additional resources for reporting. And I know we're at time, so I don't think we'll be able to answer questions, but just as a quick kind of takeaway, I want you all to think of as a reflection, what it was something that you learned today or were impacted by.
Yeah. And as we're ending today, I'll post the survey again in the chat. But I wanted to thank you all for being here today. I know that was so much information, but useful information that we absolutely need to hear. And so I wanted to thank Kelly and Solomon again for being here today and talking on this important topic. I also wanted to let you know, as mentioned, as Solomon mentioned, when we're talking about trauma and health of kiddos in their childhood, following them into their adulthood. We have a training here at CalTrin on Hope 101, which is healthy outcomes with positive experiences. And it really dives into how positive experiences can also help balance the scale when it comes to any trauma or ACEs that a child has experienced in their childhood as well. And so that would be an interesting topic for you to take a look at today. Well, with that being said, thank you all for being here today. If you have any questions, I will leave the room open just about a few more minutes. Feel free. We do have a question in the Q&A pod actually before I run. Oh, actually, we just have a thank you. It was a comment. So if you have any questions, please feel free to throw those in the chat. I know I've mentioned a couple of times in the chat as well that you'll be receiving the recording in your follow-up email, as well as the links to the videos, the links to the note-taking slides, all of that good stuff will be in that follow-up email that you used to register with today. So just make sure to keep an eye out on that. And I also wanted to mention we have the Child Labor Trafficking 101 that was done about a month ago. So if this is something that you're wanting to take into your organization and really dive into, which I highly suggest, please, those are for free on our website. You can have them access the Child Trafficking 101, and then once you dive into that as an organization, you can dive into this training as well. And so I will go ahead and close the room out. Thank you all for being here today, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.